Welcome to Securing America with me, Frank Gaffney, the program that I think of as a kind of owner's manual for protecting the country we love against all enemies, foreign and domestic, to the glory of God and his kingdom. And a man who has done outsized work on all of those fronts, I'm delighted to say, is our first guest. His name is Kevin Freeman. He's a chartered financial analyst by training, but has become one of our country's leading experts on economic warfare. He is the host on Blaze TV and other platforms of Economic War Room, an extraordinarily important program, which is accompanied by something I think is of singular importance, which are a series of battle plans about what you can do about the topics he covers on the program. Kevin is also the author of two terrific books, Secret Weapon and Game Plan, and a contributor to a great blog, globaleconomicwarfare.com. It's always good to have him with us. Kevin, welcome back to Securing America.
Thank you, Frank. It's always good to be with you.
Thank you. One of your most, I think, thoughtful and challenging programs in a way, because you're talking about some very complex subjects, is I think you call it the battle of the two dystopias. You might define the term dystopia for those of us who aren't as literate as you, but then walk us through what are you talking about in this program, and how does it bear on life as we know it now?
Well, dystopia is a type of a science fiction novel where you would describe what the future is like, and it's horrible and scary, like Terminator or something along those lines. And I'm a big fan of science fiction. I grew up loving Star Trek and Star Wars both, so I sit on both sides of the camp. But there was a bigger debate over dystopia, over what the future would look like, that took place in the 1930s and 40s between two authors, one named Aldous Huxley, who wrote the book Brave New World, and the other one, who's better known, George Orwell, who wrote Animal Farm and 1984. And they both argued over how are we going to get to this horrible condition where the government controls everything and everyone, and they had two completely different views of how to get there. And said, what Orwell said, we're going to get there this way, and Huxley said the other way. But guess what? Both are happening right now.
There was no doubt in their minds that we were going to ultimately be controlled by this oppressive form of government, a tyranny. But the question is, who was right in the end? Are we now seeing the Orwellian form of tyranny prevailing, or are we seeing the kind of, hedonistic, I guess you'd say, form or the inducement to another kind of dystopian oppression?
Well, let me describe them for you, and then you can pick. As you mentioned, hedonistic. Under Aldous Huxley, Brave New World, which I had to read in high school and hated. But nevertheless, under Huxley's view, is the entire population gets enslaved to the world state. And the world state literally says, have whatever sexual relations you want. It doesn't matter. As much as you want, just don't connect it with love and a family. Just brazen, and take the children and as early as possible indoctrinate them in eroticism and get them involved in that. And by the way, we want to separate sex and having babies, so we'll make babies in test tubes, and we're going to give everybody drugs that will solve everything. You'll get a shot for everything. And so the pharmacological industry is in charge of things. And by the way, God is science, and we have a bunch of brilliant scientists who will tell you how to live and think and act and do. And if you start to question it, take some more drugs, have some more sex. And that's the Huxley model. I mean, it looks to me like that's exactly what we're seeing in the Western model. That's George Soros and open society. Open the borders, yes. One world government, do whatever you want to as long as it's not being productive or supporting a family in a traditional sense.
So that's a pretty bleak future. And you're right. There's a lot of evidence that that is afoot in this world. How about the Orwellian style tyranny?
Well, Orwell's famous for two books, and I found those a little easier to read. One of them was 1984, which is Big Brother's watching you all the time. You get out of line, they slap you down or kill you. And in the Big Brother view of things, 1984 things, that's what we're seeing in China and Russia. And they claim that they are moralistic. And in fact, the language for most of the write ups talks about how their view of sex, for example, is very controlling, very moralistic. It sounds like a religious, hyper religious person. And yet they completely control everything. And everything is run as in Animal Farm by an elite group of people. Animal Farm was where the animals took over the farm, and then the pigs got in charge, and they said all animals are equal. All animals are equal. It's just some animals are more equal than others, like the
Right.
Chinese Communist Party, like the oligarchs, like Putin.
Hmm. So that seems pretty familiar as well. And what you're basically suggesting, I guess, in your battle between these two is which is going to become the dominant strain of oppression in our world. Does there leave any room for hope that we will be able to avoid both of these tyrannies?
Yeah, well, the Ukrainian people are caught in the middle. I mean, they're facing there's economic sanctions being tossed in on the Russians. We're closing bank accounts and shunning Russian cats from cat shows and all sorts of virtue signaling, but they're real impacts. And the Ukrainian people are witnessing tanks rolling through. We're spending our time on pronouns in our military and getting the proper pronoun
Yes.
right and trans rights and things like that. Russia's heightening their nuclear forces. Who's going to win in this? Actually, the economic weapons are very powerful, and we've talked about this, and cyber weapons. So I don't know who's going to win in this, but your bigger question, is there any hope? And that's absolutely the hope is the American people, the small
Mm.
ships of America rising up and saying, hey, we don't want your dystopia and we don't want the other guy's dystopia. So we will fight Putin and be firm on that. But at the same time, we're going to fight this ever creeping control of social media and everything else, trying to lull America into complete submission to the government. We're going to stand up for free speech, for liberty, for the Constitution. Those are the things that we must do at home.
We're going to come back in a moment, Kevin Freeman, with more on this Ukraine business and economic warfare being waged with some pretty effective, powerful weapons for sure. But just to stay with this theme, because I think it's so important, really, to talk about where we are culturally and as a society, as well as as a community that has historically been rooted in very different values and virtues and principles and constitutional rights. And not least, as I know you attach great importance to in your work, as do we, a relationship with the Almighty that, makes some of that behavior, whether it's of the depraved sexual kind or of the brutally oppressive, human freedoms crushing kind, totally anathema. And so it really comes down to this: do we still have hope for our country that the sorts of things you've described as liberty, security, and values will govern and not one or the other of these predilections?
Well, we have the good news is that the American people, the polling, and frankly, just my interactions with them and yours, the American people still believe in truth, justice, and the American way. They believe in God. They attend
Amen.
church, and they would love to see the Constitution properly followed. We have a court now that may be willing, a Supreme Court that may be willing to follow the Constitution. That's why they have to go for court packing measures and things
Right.
to disrupt the court. And we have people learning. We're training financial advisors to help people weaponize their money so they can fight back and they can say, look,
Yes.
I have a duty to God with my giving, spending, and investing to make certain that it does good things in the world and not terrible things.
Kevin, hold the thought. That is a tremendously important initiative to which I want to return after we've talked a little bit about the economic warfare underway at the moment. And then we'll take stock with you about what we can do to have it come out right for our country, for our values, and for freedom more generally. Be right back with more with Kevin Freeman right after this. It's always a pleasure to say one of our most treasured regulars here at Securing America is with us. His name is Kevin Freeman. He is the host of an absolutely marvelous television podcast and broadcast program, Economic War Room. You can find out much more about it at economicwarroom.com, which I really commend to you all. Kevin, you covered a lot of ground there at a sort of, well, philosophical, sociological, theological level. And I want to come back to the very practical right now. As you've indicated, in response to this horrific invasion and brutal attack on the people of Ukraine by Vladimir Putin and his military, governments all over the world, with the notable exception of, I guess, China and it seems India as well, and maybe a few others, but most countries, certainly in Europe, the United States, the civilized world, if you will, have retaliated against Putin with an array of economic sanctions and other, well, economic warfare techniques. Characterize both the nature of those weapons in the battle space that you're so proficient in, their effectiveness, and the possible, perhaps unintended effects of them.
Frank, I find it ironic that we're primarily waging an economic war. And if you do a Google search, I did one the other day, and 372,000 news items showed up that used the term economic warfare. When I started talking to the Pentagon, and we had a relationship then. Literally, I was told inside the building, economic warfare sounds well and good, but there's no way it can ever stop. If they roll tanks, you can't win. And
Right.
bottom line is, I said, no, this is how to do it. DARPA had me come in and I had to explain to DARPA how you could use this as an offensive weapon. And we're seeing things that they denied even were possible 10, 15 years ago when I was talking about them happening right now. And that is, you can shut down a country by controlling its banking system. You can shut down a country by stopping trade policies and by manipulating stock markets and by undermining inside the country economically. And we're using all of those weapons from the West. And as you noted, there's a distinction. China, Russia, India. Wow, wait, this is sounding like the BRICS nations minus Brazil. And they have for years, as I pointed out in my blog, planned for, prepared for, and to develop systems to not only parallel what they see in the West, but also defend against these sorts of attacks. So we're watching a battle take place that's identical to what I've written about for a dozen years, and it's happening before our eyes. And that's the same kind of technique. Go ahead.
Well, let me just back up just a moment, Kevin, because first of all, to acknowledge, your prescience in understanding this battle space and trying to get, I remember it very well, trying to get the Defense Department to appreciate its importance and to integrate it into their planning and operations, for that matter. And as you say, they weren't so interested at the time, and really, I think much of the rest of the world hasn't been either until very lately. So it's great credit to you that your thinking, your analysis has been now embraced as fully as it has. But something that you didn't say explicitly, but I think certainly is implicit in what you did say, is you can use these kinds of economic weapons if you have the reserve currency of the world and the cooperation of others who want that to be the case, and the systems that are sort of predicated on it, like this so-called SWIFT system, for example, are all going to be sustained. So that brings us to the point that you were just making, and that is, well, what if other people who don't want you to have the reserve currency of the world, who don't want to be susceptible to the kind of punishment that makes possible, engineer workarounds? So talk a little bit about that point, the vital necessity of the dollar remaining the reserve currency of the world, the challenges to its status, and whether we will in fact see these workarounds effectively enforced or catalyzed, let me say, by this kind of economic warfare taking the dollar down.
Well, I wish, Frank, that I could take credit for it. What I actually did was I noticed what Russia in particular, Russia, China's elements in the Middle East, were planning, plotting, and doing. And they were aware of the dollar reserve status and how important that was for American power. So they began to develop these systems. I noticed that and noticed the financial terror attack that took place in 2008. They have created, and they understand the dollar is the primary currency that's used by people around the world. If you want to hold extra money, you buy US Treasury bonds and stick them in your safe. But if a government realizes that the United States might cut off your ability to use, sell, exchange, barter those Treasury bonds, then they say, well, that's not good money anymore. So we need better money to put in there, whether it's gold or whether they create the digital yuan or they create some other form of currency to hold, or they hold euros instead of dollars, etc. And that's what's taken place, is that these nations have decided that the dollar is no longer the safe holding for them, because we use it against terror groups, but now we use this weapon against a nation state. And by doing so, we put the entire reserve currency at risk. If we lost the reserve currency, our inflation rate goes from 7.9%, where it is today, to 15, 20, 30, much higher percentage, because we can't finance all our spending. We think we can, we assume it, we act like we can, but we can't, because we have to depend on either the Federal Reserve printing money, or we have to depend on other governments buying our debt and holding our debt.
So when you look at these reserve currency alternatives, Kevin, I'm endlessly told, well, there just really isn't any alternative to the dollar. You've mentioned a couple candidates, but at the end of the day, I'm told, look, they have to be convertible and people have to want to hold and be paid in those other currencies. Do you see a realistic prospect that whether it's some basket of special drawing rights, whatever those are, for example, or a currency out of China, crypto, or the yuan, gold backed, or so? I mean, what else is out there that could realistically compete with the dollar or actually supplant it?
Well, all right. So that's a valid point. People will have to want to take the alternative. Here's the counterpoint. Number one is, if you tell them that if we get mad at you, you can't play with our ball, you'll go find another ball. And it could be gold, it could be digital. Look at Bitcoin and how rapidly that's risen in prominence in such a short period of time. There are
Prominence
better,
and value.
yes, there are better alternatives that are available today than old U.S. paper money. And in fact, there are better alternatives, such that the President of the United States signed an executive order that to explore creating a digital dollar as a better alternative to the current holdings. So there's no question in my mind the dollar will at some point, in its current form, lose its reserve currency status. Question is, what will it be replaced with? And right now, the Chinese are making a case, and have been for a dozen years, through the Belt and Road Initiative and through trading arrangements and so forth. They've convinced the Saudis to consider taking Chinese yuan instead of US dollars. And that's called the petrodollar, when the Saudis require you be paid in US dollars. If that breaks, that is one more prop underneath the dollar. And it's something I've talked about for a long time. We cannot be so full of ourselves to imagine that our system, our ball, is the only one the world will ever play with. We have to make it attractive, we have to make it interesting, and we have to make it better. And frankly, right now, we're not doing that. We're just being arrogant.
I know you have a very creative idea on this subject, and I'm anxious to have you talk about it, but we're hard out of time for doing it today. Kevin Freeman, thank you for this really wonderful sort of overview of the situation we find ourselves in, as I say, on a whole host of levels, but most especially in the economic warfare battle space. Keep up the great work, my friend, and come back to us again very soon. Next up, we'll speak with my colleague Kyle Shideler about the narco war at our border and what it means for you, right after this. We're back, and I'm pleased to say we're joined by one of my colleagues at the Center for Security Policy, our Director for Homeland Security and Counterterrorism. His name is Kyle Shideler. He's a great resource, and we're always delighted to have him here on Securing America. Welcome back, Kyle.
Frank, thanks for having me.
Your beat obviously includes threats to the homeland, not just literally the homeland itself. One of which that you've commented on recently is the burgeoning of the cartels, I guess rocket fueled now by both their smuggling operations made much more lucrative by the open border on this side of the line in Mexico, and also, of course, the immense amounts of money they're making smuggling things other than people, but people as well, obviously, in the human trafficking sense too. Give us a sense of what has been happening in Mexico as these cartels become increasingly not only more powerful, but also better armed and are asserting themselves very violently, even in border towns like Nuevo Laredo recently.
Sure, Frank. Well, recent incidents in Nuevo Laredo really illustrate the point pretty well. Mexican authorities made a major arrest of the leader of the cartel Northeast in Nuevo Laredo recently. And in response, the cartel and its armed wing, it's a cartel with an armed wing now, which call themselves the Troops from Hell, established roadblocks and began to assault military installations and even fired on the U.S. consulate because this cartel leader was extradited to the United States. So you saw essentially what was supposed to be a law enforcement operation very quickly devolves into something with a military and a national security dimension. And it illustrates for us that the situation in Mexico is not a law enforcement problem anymore. It is a insurgency. It is a counterinsurgency problem.
Wow.
The cartels have the ability to use military force to project their will upon the Mexican government. And I fear if something isn't done, they will eventually decide that they can project their will even on the U.S. government. We had a alarm at the Nuevo Laredo consulate the day after this assault. It turned out to be a false alarm, but I think their fear and their caution is reasonable. If the U.S. Does something like an extradition of one of these cartel leaders, it is entirely possible that the cartels may decide to retaliate against us.
Wow.
Then what are we going to do? This is a
Yeah,
major, major problem, and it is
Kyle,
fueled, as you said, by the open border.
one other piece of this, just to tease this out a little bit, when you talk about this now being a military grade problem and an insurgency, in fact, and therefore for well the Mexican government and for us, arguably, a counterinsurgency challenge is a function of the increased firepower of these forces. I heard a soundtrack this morning of some of this battle taking place in Nuevo Laredo, and it was clear that fully automatic weapons were being used by these criminal elements in the cartel. Talk a little bit about this. I mean, it harkens back to the good old days when we were just watching the U.S. government smuggling semi-automatic weapons to the cartels in Fast and Furious under the Obama administration. But where are they getting these more powerful weapons, and what else have they got in their kit?
Well, we need to remember these are fully transnational organizations.
Mm.
They have relationships with criminal elements and terrorist elements around the world. So
And
while
governments.
the Mexican authorities often like to blame weapons going across the U.S. into Mexico, and there is some of that, and we can't ignore that, the reality is that they have the ability to get their hands on fully military grade weapons, anti tank rockets. They have drones, relatively cheap drones, but which they've managed to manufacture to be able to drop explosives, which was a recent incident in another
Wow.
cartel area a few weeks ago. So you're talking, as I said, about a genuine insurgency, armored vehicles, full on military weapons. and they can provide these things for themselves with the networks that they have established internationally.
Let me turn to the United States itself, Kyle, because as you know so well, as a result of your research and great analyses, we're now witnessing criminal elements in this country. Some of them, I believe, if not actually the cartels themselves, then certainly doing business with them, drug, uh, smuggling and distribution, human smuggling for that matter, and probably, if the decision is made to do it, smuggling in some pretty nasty weapons as well. We're at a moment when there is still this hangover, it seems, from the so-called summer of love and the whole argument that we need to defund our police. Um, Joe Biden, astonishingly, among the other disinformation he disseminated in his State of the Union address, what I call the gaslighting of the Union address, was that he actually was for funding the police rather than defunding them. But talk about where we are now, specifically, Kyle, with respect to what we've seen work. It's been shown demonstrably to work, namely proactive policing, and how that still differs from what we're doing in a lot of places across this country, and with what effect.
Well, first of all, not only does Joe Biden not want to fund the police, but Joe Biden's party, the Democrats, openly treat law enforcement as though they were terrorists. The Democrats' counterterrorism agenda identifies law enforcement as being a den of extremists, uh, much like protesters at a school board. That is the approach that the Biden administration takes to local police in this country. So the idea that they care about funding the police is, as you said, Frank, it's a gaslight. It's nonsense. They're simply being untruthful. But we should remember it is not just about money. Obviously, funding the police is vital, but it is also about morale. It is about how police are treated. No police officer in this country wants to risk the possibility that they're going to go to jail uh, because they make a decision at a split second to try to save a life, which is often what happens. I mean, you had a case where they tried to gin up something against a police officer who shot a woman who was assaulting another woman with a knife, like was in the process of stabbing someone, and he made the decision to act, and that was treated as though he had simply murdered her out of hand. That is the relationship that the police are dealing with, thanks to the ideology of Black Lives Matter, which has been fully accepted by the left in this country. And
Yeah.
until we adjust that, you're going to see police officers who are afraid, rightfully, to police. Now, fortunately, we have communities in this country like Florida under Governor Ron DeSantis, where they are openly backing police. They're urging police to come. They're offering funds for police who choose to leave some of these communities that have shown that they don't respect their police. So I think you're going to find in America there are going to be communities that are very well policed, and there are going to be communities that aren't policed at all.
Yeah. And what are the implications of that, Kyle? I mean, they may seem obvious, but for those who are in the latter category, either because that's where they've always lived or because they have to live there because that's where their jobs are or for whatever other reason, if they can't up and leave to go to a free state like Florida and enjoy the protections of the police there, what are the options for turning this thing around? Again, when you hear the president professing to renounce the policies that he ran on, let's face it, certainly Kamala Harris did in the 2020 election, surely there's now latitude for rethinking not just the funding issues, but the broader policy and most especially, as you say, the support from um, their superiors, including those that George Soros got elected in some cases, to ensure that those communities are policed adequately as well.
Well, we certainly are seeing signs of life in some of these towns. San Francisco, Los Angeles have recall efforts against their district attorneys who are I don't think it's too much to say practically in bed with the criminal element, letting them out of jail, not trying to enforce the law. But ultimately, Frank, it sort of brings us full circle, because if you have communities that are not policed by the government, they will be policed by someone. Uh, Nature abhors a vacuum. And if you have a situation where the criminals have driven out the police, you will get situations like Seattle's Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone. You will get ideologies and groups that move in there and take control, like we are seeing, on our southern border with Mexico. That is what happens. That is how what starts off as a law enforcement problem becomes a national security problem, because you have abdicated your responsibility to govern ultimately to all manner of threats. And
Yeah.
we are seeing them do that in some of these cities.
This is a subject of a terrific book that you've done on the subject, Kyle. Unmasking Antifa, as I recall, is that the title?
That's right. Mm-hmm.
And how can people find it?
Sure. You can find it on Amazon at Unmasking Antifa, 5 Perspectives on a Growing Threat. You can also find a link at securefreedom.org.
Yeah, this is vitally important that we understand the kind of people who will fill the vacuum, or for that matter, are contributing to the conditions that give rise to this lawlessness and demands for defunding those who would try to bring and enforce the rule of law for all of our benefits. Kyle Shideler, thanks for the great work you do at the Center for Security Policy. I hope we'll be able to talk to you again next week and regularly thereafter. It's vital that we cover this topic well. Next up, we'll speak with Dr. Peter Vincent Pry about, well, is Putin thinking the unthinkable about nuclear war? Straight ahead. Welcome back. And I want to say I'm very pleased to have with us for this block and the next a man that I have known and worked with for decades and regard very highly, particularly on matters involving nuclear weaponry and deterrence strategy and the dangers of failing to do that in a world in which there are, unfortunately, no longer two nuclear armed powers, the United States and the Soviet Union back in the day, but a number of them and a growing number at that. His name is Colonel Dan Gallington, United States Air Force retired. He has been, in addition to a distinguished military officer, Defense Department Deputy Assistant Secretary. He's worked in the Justice Department in a senior post there, as well as the General Counsel, the last bipartisan General Counsel, as a matter of fact, of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. A man of considerable ability as well as a great heart. And it's great to have him with us to talk a bit about some of the most challenging problems we're facing at the moment in the form of nuclear threats. Dan Gallington, welcome to Securing America. It's good to have you, sir.
Thank you, Frank. It's always a pleasure. And I keep thinking about how long we've been friends. It's been, decades,
It's been
three
a
or
long
four.
time. Dan, let me start by asking you about something that over the course of those decades, I know you have done, which is think about the unthinkable. You've done it in the Defense Department, in uniform, in the Air Force, of course, but also in the arms control environment in which we worked back in the day, the Reagan administration. Um, Another guy who has been doing a lot of thinking about nuclear weapons and their use, it turns out, is a fellow by the name of Vladimir Putin. Talk a little bit, if you would, Dan, about the evidence that we have that Putin thinks, and he's not alone in this, but he is a prominent exemplar of it, that nuclear wars actually can be fought and won.
You know, I've always thought if I could talk to Vladimir, just the two of us, that I could get him to acknowledge that he is essentially motivated by the tripwire concept that we used as a deterrence in NATO back in the 50s and 60s. And you may obviously remember we had small nuclear weapons, we had nuclear artillery, we had The Army even had nuclear mortars
Rockets,
and
yes.
short range nuclear weapons that we basically told the Russians, look, you come through the Fulda Gap and we'll nuke your butt. And we'll do it with these small, usable nuclear weapons. And I've always thought that Putin's desire to build up a force of thousands of these, and then to issue new doctrines where he says, I can use one of these weapons in a conventional conflict and I can win the war. I can cause you to stand down just by virtue of using that. So I've always thought
which he's called escalate to de-escalate, I think, as a doctrine.
Exactly. And I think you probably could give that name to Tripwire, the old strategy we had. And of course, that scared the heck out of the Russians.
So, Dan Gallington, one of the things that has impressed me most about what Putin has been doing in this space, in addition to his declaratory policy, his doctrine, is he not only has a large number of these nuclear weapons, tactical as well as theater and strategic in character, but he's modernized all of them, it seems. Very recently and very comprehensively, a colleague of ours has reported that maybe 22 different nuclear weapon systems have been introduced by the Russians in the past few years. But even more worrying, Dan, is that Vladimir Putin has, over his time as president, and I guess prime minister as well, personally presided over simulated thermonuclear weapons attacks against our country. Some of them in cahoots with the Chinese, no less. Put all this together for us and just talk about, does this suggest that he's not only thinking about the unthinkable, but that he actually plans to use nuclear weapons at some point?
I'm reminded of one of the generals that was the commander-in-chief for SAC, who said deterrence is a combination of capability and will. And when you see the kind of things you've described going on in Russia with Putin, who's not a military guy, he's an intelligence street guy, basically, a thug, and KGB kind of street thug. And you can see his suspicion of the military insofar as he's replaced and over again replaced all the people that work around him. I read a story just today that he has gotten rid of 1,000 of people that work close to him because he's afraid of some kind of a coup because his popularity has dwindled quite a bit. And he did this. He did this exercise in the stadium in front of all these cheering people as for a domestic product. But all this together, you see him manifesting this concept of capability and will. Would he, in fact, use a tactical nuclear weapon?
Well, Dan, I want to drill down on that a little bit more, and we're going to take a short break. And when we come back, let's explore the circumstances under which that use might take place, what kinds of targets you think might be selected for the purpose. But clearly, it's against the backdrop of a policy approach to Ukraine that seems to be essentially destroying the entire place, if need be. So these are simply the most efficient means of accomplishing that, as well as perhaps decisively ending the conflict on his terms. We're going to talk about that and much more with Dan Gallington, Colonel Dan Gallington, a specialist in these matters, on the other side of a very short break. Stay tuned. back. We are talking with Colonel Dan Gallington, United States Air Force retired, former senior civilian in the Pentagon and other agencies of our government with a very distinguished record of service to our country. We're talking about nuclear warfighting and the possibility that that may be something Vladimir Putin is actually not only equipped to do, but has the will and the intent to do as well. Dan, before the break, we talked a little bit about the capabilities that Putin has put into place. Uh, some of those are tactical weapons. I don't know whether we know whether they have been forward deployed with units now engaged in Ukraine, or whether they are in the rear echelon. Any insights into that? And more to the point, you've suggested that he may well be willing to use these weapons. I'd be interested in your thoughts as to how that might be accomplished and against what kinds of targets.
Again, alluding to the period of the 1950s and the tripwire, which I think, as I said, if I had a conversation with him, I could get him to acknowledge how that impressed upon him the idea that there was a nuclear response if they attacked us conventionally through the Fulda Gap. There was a nuclear response. I think he has the same mindset, and I think they have, as we did in the 50s in NATO, fully integrated the tactical nuclear weaponry within a conventional utilization of the army, which he's done in Ukraine. Would I be surprised?
So you would say that they probably have tactical nuclear weapons
I would not
with
be.
those
Oh,
forces now engaged in this
yeah,
invasion?
absolutely. I would not be surprised to learn or have him acknowledge that yes, there are tactical nuclear weapons deployed in the Ukraine. I wouldn't be surprised at all.
So you've mentioned several times the Fulda Gap as kind of our
Right.
counterpart, a choke point that we would have tried to use them back in the
Right.
day when we had inadequate conventional capabilities to stop an invasion. He's engaged in an invasion.
Exactly.
If his purpose is to so suppress the Ukrainians to compel their surrender, what kinds of use might you expect him to
I
make of
would
these
say
weapons?
probably I would call it, and this is my own word. I would say it's a demonstration.
Mm.
One or two tactical nuclear weapons, possibly in an area where there would be some destruction, certainly, but there wouldn't be the kind of massive human toll that we would ordinarily associate with nuclear weapons. And I think they would be done uh, purely for demonstration. Here is what we're talking about. And if you didn't believe me, here it is. And if you maybe they do one day and say something like that, and then say and do another one another day. I mean, this guy is, he's a poker player, and he likes this sort of repartee with the West. And as you mentioned, Frank, uh, he knows, like everyone else in the world knows, that when we get into a war, it's always by virtue of some surprise attack. Look at our history.
Yeah.
The way to beat us and bring us down is to attack us without warning. And he,
Right. That
yes,
that brings me to the next
right,
question, Dan, and it's the multi-trillion-dollar question, I guess. One of our colleagues, Dr. Peter Vincent Pry, has recently written that Putin, in his modernization program, most especially, has engineered his strategic nuclear
yes,
forces, that is, ones that are not tactical, not theater,
right,
but
yeah,
long range, capable of reaching us either from the heartland of this Russian empire of his, or perhaps its ports for submarines based
yeah,
there or close in, let alone in the broad ocean areas or with bombers. But that his preparations, including, by the way, going back to your anecdote earlier about protecting his
right,
leadership, not necessarily the entire population, but the people that he cares about, is such that he may well be able to effect a surprise nuclear strike against the country. And as I say, he has actually, presided over simulations of such
Yeah, and why
attacks.
else would you
Is that a realistic expectation and
exactly?
concern?
And why else would you configure and design your strategic forces that way, unless it was your premise that they would never be used as a defensive situation or response. They would always be used
Retaliation.
as an attack initiation. Look at that another weapon that they fielded, this long range artificially manned nuclear submarine. What do you use something like that for? If
Yeah.
it's not
This intercontinental torpedo, it's also been
exactly.
called, intercontinental range, that has reportedly 100 megaton warhead on it, unbelievably large and hugely destructive. If it were to hit a port in this country, it would devastate it and the region around it for probably millennia. The thought that is so worrying about this is these are the sorts of weapons that somebody who is deadly serious about doing mass harm to our country would produce, deploy, and may much be willing to use. What do we need to take away from all of this, Dan? Most especially with
Well, I
respect to
think
deterring such use.
you and I would probably, again, if we were just chatting informally, would agree that we need both a short-term approach and we need a longer-term approach. The short-term approach needs to be focused on strategic defense and ways we can protect ourselves from these very scary nuclear threats you've described. And yet a longer term approach to develop and to renew our own force structure. I mean, we're talking about a force structure, Frank,
Yes.
that's 50 years old. I read an article.
No, that's right. 50 years old and no missile
Exactly.
defense at all. Dan, we have to leave it at that. These are
Sure.
topics to which I hope we can return with you very soon. Thank you for your service to our country,
Thanks, Frank.
not least what you've just rendered on our program. We'll talk with you soon. I appreciate the rest of you being with us for this edition of Securing America. I hope you feel better equipped to do just that. Visit securingamerica.tv for more on what you can do. And then, as I'm fond of saying, go forth and multiply.